The Health Secretary erodes the 4-hour target for waiting in A&E, but denies there is a humanitarian crisis in the NHS. Good evening. The government is losing the battle to contain the burgeoning dependence on A&E. Patients deemed less than an emergency will now no longer necessarily be seen within 4 hours. This on a day when the Prime Minister made a rare speech devoted to the concept of a sharing society. One group of patients who have not been getting a share are those under 18 suffering from serious mental health issues. They are now to be prioritised. Meantime, a mother grieves for her adolescent daughter sent 300 miles from Nottingham to Edinburgh for treatment.
It's just really, really hard. And I hope Theresa May's listening and Jeremy Hunt are listening, because this has to stop, because it's destroying people like us and our families.
Also tonight, Northern Ireland thrown into political crisis as the Deputy First Minister, Sinn Féin's, resigns. Prompted by a scandal of wasted public money, his move is likely to force a new election. Is Britain facing a new wave of union militancy? London's brought to a standstill by the tube strike, and there's more industrial action on the way. You're safe in a roller, though. The luxury car maker, owned by German BMW, recommits to Britain despite Brexit.
Also tonight, Trump's reputation goes to Hollywood. His wilder statements, including that in which he mimicked a disabled reporter, become the ammunition of the creative elite.
When the person asking to sit in the most respected seat in our country imitated a disabled reporter, it kind of broke my heart.
Ministers from Theresa May downwards have denied that England is facing a humanitarian crisis in the NHS. The unprecedented claim from the Red Cross persuaded the Health Secretary to appear today before MPs, telling them that hospitals will be able to take action, including warning non-urgent cases over the 4-hour A&E waiting limit and cancelling outpatient appointments to help cope with growing demand over the winter. Our health and social care correspondent Victoria MacDonald has this.
Just after lunch today, Nottingham University Hospital Trust declared a black alert, a message to staff and community teams: more beds needed. Hull Royal Infirmary postponed operations today, saying its beds were full. Princess Alexandra in Harlow declared a level 4 alert, the highest they can go. This was meant to be a day about mental health, with a major announcement from the Prime Minister. Instead, the Health Secretary had to come to the Commons this afternoon to answer questions on winter pressures. He insisted it was just a few trusts in trouble, but he did issue a warning over the 4-hour A&E target.
This government is committed to maintaining and delivering that vital 4-hour commitment to patients. But since it was announced in 2000, there are nearly 9 million more visits to our A&Es, up to 30% of whom NHS England estimate do not need to be there, and the tide is continuing to rise. So if we are going to protect our 4-hour standard, we need to be clear it is a promise to sort out all urgent health problems within 4 hours, but not all health problems, however minor.
This caused surprise and was taken at first to mean that Mr Hunt was downgrading the target. The Department of Health was forced into clarifying it, saying it meant instead that more needs to be done to divert the patients who don't need to be there.
I think if he was to acknowledge the crisis, people would respect that and start to work with him. But until he acknowledges that there's a real problem, we're not going to be able to take things forward and make things better for the patients, because they're the ones who are suffering.
The mental health announcement brought a welcome focus on children and adolescent services, including training for secondary schools.
There is no escaping the fact that people with mental health problems are still not treated the same as if they have a physical ailment, or the fact that all of us, government, employers, schools, charities, need to do more to support all of our mental well-being.
And yet the question was, where is the money? Tricky on a day when NHS finances were under such scrutiny. This mother, Rachel, watched the Prime Minister's speech somewhat in despair. We can't identify her or her daughter. She told us of the battle to get urgent inpatient care for her 17-year-old who was suffering from anorexia.
She says there aren't any easy answers, but there was quite clearly a contributing cause to this crisis that we're in, and that is a massive, massive underfunding of all children's services, and particular CAMHS services, during the last government and during her government.
And she feels it acutely. Her daughter was finally found a bed in Scotland, 300 miles from their home.
It's devastating, it really is. You know, all the time you just feel like there's a part of you missing. And if she was more local, I'd be able to go and see her, wouldn't I, and pop in and see her and give her a hug. I can't do that. We have to plan this, we have to book our flights. I'm going up on Thursday and staying overnight Friday. But then I've got my other 2 girls that also need me at home that are worried and are unhappy that I'm not going to be here. I'm being pulled in all these different directions. It's just really, really hard. And I hope Theresa May's listening and Jeremy Hunt are listening, because this has to stop, because it's destroying people like us and our families.
The government did pledge more money for children's mental health 2 years ago, but it hasn't always reached its intended target.
Just having the Prime Minister stating that this is her priority will make people focus and make commissioners focus on where they're spending their funds, and the NHS bosses recognise that this is important. They can't just ignore children and young people's mental health again, because it has been ignored for too many years. But the trouble is, it's a long way from what the Prime Minister is saying to the frontline services. And in reality, there is no additional funding that has been promised here.
The Health Secretary has now put himself in charge of mental health and declared his commitment to improving services. But for the moment, his attention is repeatedly diverted by the seemingly relentless pressures on England's hospitals.
Victoria MacDonald reporting. Well, now, one of the hospitals that has come under the most severe strain in recent weeks has been the Queen's Medical Centre in Nottingham. Our correspondent, Kami Nzerim, is there now. Kami.
That's right, John. As Victoria described, the picture here in Nottingham really is one of a system that is being stretched to its limits. The hospital put out a tweet today, a public tweet, a public message urging people not to come to A&E unless it was absolutely necessary. They had some numbers, some figures to support that request, that argument. They said that there were already 132 people waiting to be seen, and that many of them were having to wait in excess of the 4-hour target, the 4-hour target for A&E services. This data was supported by recent figures put out by the local ambulance service. They said that over the New Year period, they'd received double the number of calls that they would normally expect to receive, calls that pertain to potentially life-threatening. So where does this leave us? Well, the Trust said they are still on black alert, and they are reaching out to local partners, local health partners, late night services, out of hours services, local GPs to step in and try and help them take up some of the slack. But this isn't just the picture here. It is really redolent of the situation in many parts of the country.
Kami Nzerim. Well, the health service, in particular support for those suffering mental health problems, was at the centre of the Prime Minister's first big speech of 2017 this morning. It was part of Theresa May's vision of what she calls a shared society, tackling injustices which leave many ordinary families feeling they're being left behind by the rich and powerful. Here's our political editor, Gary Gibbon.
Prime Minister, is there a crisis in the health service?
Theresa May promised her government would put mental health issues at the heart of its work, rethinking how government helps at every stage of life.
What I'm announcing are the first steps in our plan to transform the way we deal with mental health problems at every stage of a person's life, not in our hospitals, but in our classrooms, at work, and in our communities.
The Prime Minister announced a programme of training for schools to spot pupils suffering anxiety, depression, a review of mental health in the workplace, including a look at discrimination laws to protect those facing disciplinary action or job loss, and an expansion of online therapy treatment. Under David Cameron, the government injected an extra $1 billion of spending into mental health, but many NHS bosses have been grabbing that money to plug holes in other health services. Mrs May said she'd hold those managers to account.
Are you actually really going to forcibly ring-fence that? Surely you accept they're only doing that because they're desperate to deal of physical health.
Obviously, we recognise the pressures that the NHS has been under over the winter. This is not unusual. There are always extra pressures for the NHS over the winter period. But if you look at what has happened in terms of funding for the NHS, of course, we have put that extra funding into the NHS.
So, no indications of extra money for the NHS today. Several in the audience noted strong echoes of the speech David Cameron gave as Prime Minister almost a year ago to the day.
Up to 1 in 4 of us.
1 in 4 of us has a common mental disorder at any one time.
Breaking the mental health taboo.
Breaking the stigma.
I believe we can lead a revolution
to transform our approach to mental health
in Britain.
Did you spot any differences with David Cameron's speech in this one?
Well, I think the two Prime Ministers have spoken about mental health. They put it in a wider context of wider social injustice or the big society, however it may be described. And I think the approaches have some similarities. However, I detected in this Prime Minister an intention to put mental health right at the heart of policy making.
I think Theresa May is very nervous about taking on the huge costs that are going to be involved to give any parity between physical and mental illness.
And can you do anything if you don't do that? Can you really achieve anything?
You can't take away the kind of suffering we come across all the time.
Mrs May repeated her analysis that the referendum result last summer was in part a cry of pain from working class families struggling with household finances, often not on any benefits. Now susceptible, she thought, to far-right or hard-left messages, thanks to the negligence of her predecessors in office.
We see those fringe voices gaining prominence in some countries across Europe today. Voices from the hard left and the far right, stepping forward and sensing that this is their time. But they stand on the shoulders of mainstream politicians who've allowed unfairness and division to grow by ignoring the legitimate concerns of ordinary people for too long.
Theresa May said she wanted to stop people feeling locked out and left behind. She said government under her would go further to help them. And she called this the shared society.
And Gary Gibbon joins us live now from Westminster. Gary, what is the shared society?
Well, we've got a probably clearer idea today of exactly who Theresa May is aiming the shared society plan at, and that's the people, as she said there, who are just above the benefit level, although I suspect from her description of them, quite a few of them would have got tax credits in the past. As for the actual shape of this bolder, more innovative state that steps up to help with solutions, no, I think I'd be lying if I said we got a really clear picture of that. I asked her just after the speech if it would, under her plans, be a bigger state, and she said it would be a more strategic state. And over the years I've come to see that as the answer that people give if they want a state that's about the same size or smaller. We do know, though, that she's very proud of her time in the Home Office, reducing, as she's told people, the police budget, and yet she would say getting more from less, lower crime. So I wouldn't be expecting much cash bonanza.
Just to move on to another topic, though, the pound took a dive today. Well, what's her view of that?
She was asked about that as well, and she said that she thought what had happened is that reporters talking about hard Brexit after her interview on Sunday television, that they had contributed to the problem that had made traders run away from the pound. Well, I think what you've got to say to that is what we know about the general direction of travel of the Brexit plan, almost certainly out of the single market as we know it, out of the customs union as we know it. Traders are entitled to think that that is one definition of hard Brexit, and I think if we're heading in that direction, we may get the pound may get a few more days like today.
Thanks, Gary.
Well, I've been speaking with the Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, and I began by asking him whether today's announcement would simply reverse government cuts to mental health funding from the last 5 years.
I think there have been cuts in parts of the NHS in mental health over many years because it's sort of been the poor relation. And sometimes when people have been short of money in a particular part of the NHS, they've raided the mental health budget, and that has got to stop. And Theresa May is signalling today that mental health is going to be one of the big priorities, if not the big priority for the NHS. But actually over the last 5 years, the number of people getting mental health treatment in the NHS has gone up by about 1,400 a day. Where we're not good is children's mental health. And we think that about 3 children in every classroom have a diagnosable mental health condition. and we're only helping a quarter of them, and that is not acceptable.
It has been developing all the period of 4.5 years that you've been Secretary of State, and nothing's been done.
Well, I accept, and that's why I'm saying today that we haven't done as well as we should for children. We've done a lot in many other areas of mental health, but now we need to do children. And when it comes to children, although there has been some improvement in provision, we think that the biggest area that we need to focus on is schools, because it's partly about what the NHS provides, but it's also partly about spotting problems earlier, and schools can help us do that.
But the fact is that there's evidence that even monies that were targeted and plans that were targeted for mental health, in the end, got spent on other things, mainly acute physical problems.
Well, I think that has been a structural problem in the NHS for many years, because you have...
Yeah, but how do you stop money and effort that you're putting into mental health being diverted to crises in physical health?
Firstly, by what we're announcing today. This is making clear that it's not just a priority of the Health Secretary, it's a priority of the Prime Minister to sort this out. But secondly, this year we've become the first country in the world to publish Ofsted-style rankings of the performance of mental health provision for every area of the country. So the areas that do raise their mental health budget to put them into their local hospital will be called out for it.
In a sense, isn't there a danger that in looking at the mental health system, and you've been very candid about how broken it has been, essentially describes the state of the National Health Service itself. And after all, it is the Red Cross who have said it is a humanitarian crisis.
Well, I don't accept what the Red Cross have said, but, you know, I'm a politician, so maybe we should look at what independent people are saying about this. Chris Hobson, who represents...
Well, who's independent? The Red Cross are pretty independent, aren't they?
Well,
except that you depend upon them to get people home from hospital.
But let's look at, and we pay them to do that, by the way, but let's look at what other independent people are saying, like the people who represent all the hospitals in the NHS who've been strong critics of aspects of government policy.
Why not look at what the Red Cross is saying? Because after all, the Red Cross is something which is a constant in everybody's town and village. They all know about the British Red Cross. And if the British Red Cross is telling them there's a crisis, we ought possibly to take some note of it.
Yes, but we also have to look at what other independent people are saying, and what the people who actually represent the hospitals are saying is that we have very severe problems in a small number of hospitals, which no one is trying to underestimate. But the vast majority of hospitals are actually coping slightly better than this time last year.
There were hospitals in Britain that had to shut their doors because they reached 100%.
It failed in some hospitals, and we've had some very serious problems in those.
2 people died on trolleys in Worcester. I mean, the investigation started on Friday. This is happening now.
Well, Worcestershire is probably the hospital which we're most worried about of all, because what happened there was very serious. But I just think it's wrong for people watching this programme to think that this is a generalised picture, because actually what's happening in most hospitals is the pressure is extreme. They've never worked harder. They are doing an incredible job, but actually they are managing to cope.
As mental health is the focus, let's have a final question on how soon will you see a significant, visible change in the treatment of young people in the mental health service of the NHS?
Well, that's a kind of good question that I'd expect you to put to me. So let me give you...
And you're going to spend some time trying to think what the answer is.
I want to give you a decent reply. It takes time to train up people. So if we want to improve the provision in every single secondary school, 4,000 secondary schools, it takes time. I would be very disappointed if there wasn't a visible improvement by the time we go to the country at the next election.
Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt talking to me earlier.
Well, I'm joined now by Jessica Britton-George, a junior A&E doctor who works in a North London hospital. So Jeremy Hunt there says he doesn't want people to get the sense that this is a generalised problem, that the crisis is widespread. What's your experience?
I think it's been a long time since Jeremy has been in an A&E recently. Almost everyone I know, so obviously working in A&E, you get to know lots of people in your speciality. We're cracking under the pressure. There are a lot of people in hospitals. There are a lot of filled beds with people who can't get home, and there is no space. And he talks about the increased burden on the health service, which I would agree with. There are many reasons why we have more people coming through the doors, but that doesn't change the fact that we're breaching our targets. We're giving people the care that we don't want to give them, like they were saying about Worcester, and we're letting people down.
Have you got a political axe to grind? Some people think junior doctors trying to bring down the government.
Yeah, I'm a renegade, actually. I'm always trying to topple governments in my spare time. No, I haven't. I mean, I think every political party that's ever been in power in this country, or indeed in any country, will find themselves fighting with people who are providing free healthcare. And I think that's the biggest problem here. We're providing free healthcare to something that I would say this government feel could be very easily monetised.
So give us a sense of the weights in your A&E and the people on trolleys and, you know, the acuteness of it.
So I'm absolutely blessed that I'm on a week off this week. But last week, for example, we had 16 or 17 patients in our corridor. Not in our corridor just because they come off an ambulance, in our corridor because they needed treatment and they needed antibiotics.
And that's unusual, is it?
That is unusual. I mean, so I've been working in A&E for about 2 years now, most of the time in London, and I did some in Wales as well. And we always manage, through the beauty of bed managers and excellently trained nurses, to reshuffle beds and find people who possibly could go home at 11 o'clock at night. And at the moment, we just can't find that capacity.
And is this just a January thing? I mean, do you think if we wait a couple of weeks, it'll all calm down again? Or?
It's so difficult to predict. So last year, our winter crisis was lengthy. Crisis being quite a difficult term. But the burden was lengthy, and it was cold weather, and it was people being more poorly. And we have quite an ageing population. And, you know, that's going to continue for as long as we manage to keep people alive. So I don't think saying that we can brush this off as, oh, January will be awful because everyone was holding on for Christmas, but February will be fine. I don't think that's a good way to plan for our healthcare system.
Now, Jeremy Hunt today said 30% or up to 30% of people going to A&E don't need to be there and they won't be counted anymore in this 4-hour waiting target. Would you agree it's about 3 out of 10 people who shouldn't be there? And what do you think about this moving of the target?
So it's quite difficult. I never thought I'd find myself saying that I agree with the Health Secretary, but in this I do. I don't think that using the 4-hour target for people who don't need to be in A&E is a good idea. I would love to know how he defines his 30% of people who don't need to be in A&E. There are a lot of ways to do it, through our triage system, through the people that are very experienced nurses at the front door send away. The people that are very experienced nurses send to the GP because they know they don't need to be seen in A&E. But as a clinician, I would find it hard to say this is the absolute 30% that don't belong here. So I'm not sure how somebody who's a politician can make that definition.
Jessica Britton-George, thank you very much indeed. John.
And later in the programme, we'll be debating Theresa May's vision of a shared society and how it might help those suffering from mental health problems. Now, a major development in Northern Ireland. The Deputy First Minister, Martin McGuinness, has resigned his post, sparking a constitutional crisis which is likely to force new elections. He said he was leaving in protest at the executive's handling of a botched public heating scheme, which could end up costing taxpayers almost £500 million. But as our chief correspondent Alex Thompson now reports, even bigger stakes are now in play.
It's all about a whole lot more than a scandal over heating payments. The historic marathon which led to the Good Friday Agreement a generation ago. Now Sinn Féin accuses the ruling Democratic Unionists and successive British governments of failing to live up to the deal. Martin McGuinness and Sinn Féin have simply had enough.
So we in Sinn Féin will not tolerate the arrogance of Arlene Foster and the DUP. Sinn Féin wants equality and respect for everyone. And that's what this process must be about.
Cross-party pressure on First Minister Arlene Foster has been building over this for months. When she spoke recently on the issue, the chamber emptied in protest, everyone leaving bar her own party. She welcomes an inquiry but won't step down in order for it to start, the key Sinn Féin demand. In a statement tonight, Arlene Foster said,
"We will have no government and no way to resolve the RHI problems. It is clear that Sinn Féin's actions are not principled and they are..."
Nicknamed the Cash for Ash scheme, across Northern Ireland people were paid more the more renewable fuel they burned, till the bill reached almost £500 million for the Assembly. You could turn up your heating, open the windows to keep cool and get paid even more, and people did. With McGuinness gone tonight and Sinn Féin refusing to appoint another Deputy First Minister, the power-sharing Assembly effectively collapses into likely election, with critics accusing Sinn Féin of achieving nothing.
I would urge the political parties, the leaders of the political parties, to come together to work together to find a solution.
But what of Martin McGuinness himself?
Excuse the hoarseness of my voice, but I'll do my best to try to be understood.
Clearly suffering health issues these days. This was a resignation, but was it also a retirement? He would not comment.
Well, if after Mrs May's speech today, failings in the public services are among the everyday injustices she wants to tackle, she only had to look out of any window in London today to find an example. A 24-hour strike by London Underground workers forced 2 million commuters to find alternative ways into work and brought gridlock to the capital streets. There seems to be a new mood of union militancy in the air, with the long-running Southern Rail dispute continuing, BA cabin crew striking tomorrow, and nuclear workers and those on Arriva Rail North launching strike ballots. Here's our business correspondent, Helia Ebrahimi.
London is open to the world.
A New Year's resolution already broken, just 9 days after Sadiq Khan's jubilant boast. For the 4 million people who rely on the tube, today they found the doors barred and the capital ground to a standstill. With frustration clearly getting the better of some people.
2 hours I've been waiting here. We all knew this was going to happen. Why have they not organised this better?
I pay £212 for this every month. £212. This is what I get. It's not fair at all.
I tried to do it this way, but they won't let me.
The Underground supports almost as many commuters as the rest of the UK's entire rail network, with today's estimated bill running into the tens of millions.
I've been here over an hour and it's been a nightmare.
Causing misery for millions of Londoners.
It's a nightmare, I can't get in, but I'm trying to take the boat now.
The problem for those fed up with today is that the unions are warning there could be more to come.
Would your members be happy to take more industrial action if you don't get what you want?
Our members are not happy to take any industrial action. They don't want to cause this inconvenience, but they feel they need to do so.
Basically, you would take more strike action if you don't get the result you want.
Our members at the end of the day are not happy to take industrial, but they're prepared to take industrial action to see if they can get a proper, safe system put back into place.
But the system was out of date, according to the last mayor, who was looking to cut costs and up automation. 838 jobs were set for the axe, with ticket offices closing down, the apparent saving £50 million a year. Now Sadiq Khan, the new London mayor, has promised to reinstate 200 of those posts. But that's not good enough, say the unions.
Would 400 jobs be enough?
Well, I'm not going to talk about a number because the difficulty we've got is that, we get incremental change. The other day it was 150, now it's 200. How did they decide to move from 100 to 50 to 200? Are they guessing or have they got a plan? The aim is to get the right number of staff.
Is that 800?
Well, it could
back?
it could be less, it could be more. London Underground management are under severe financial pressure. It's money at the end of the day because they're facing cuts imposed by central government.
Public patience could be tested not just by action in London, but also a wave of strikes that could paralyse an already fragile transport system. Tomorrow, Southern Rail train drivers will kick off 6 days of January strikes. At the same time, British Airways cabin crew will start 48 hours of industrial action, hitting Heathrow holidaymakers. Arriva train workers are set to be balloted about pay, as well as the future of their jobs as companies switch to driver-only trains. The same issue is brewing at Merseyrail too.
It would be easy to try and draw parallels between what's happening today and Jim Callaghan's winter of discontent. For decades now, industrial action has been on the wane, but we're entering an era of seismic technological change that threatens swathes of jobs. Not just for rail staff, but for the professions too, like medicine and law. The question is, how will the workforce deal with this?
The union's bone of contention is that this is much more about companies creaming off profits than it is a revolution in the way we work. If there's a change coming, it shouldn't be at the expense of their workers.
Well, while London's commuters were crammed onto buses or forced to walk or cycle, there was better news for those who don't rely on public transport. Rolls-Royce has renewed its commitment to Britain after seeing a jump in sales and revenue. The German-owned company had warned before the EU referendum that a vote for Brexit would push up costs and might affect employment in Britain. Our business editor, Siobhan Kennedy, took a ride with the company's boss.
There may have been gridlock across much of London today as a tube strike brought the capital to a standstill. But getting around was easier for some than for others. The boss of Rolls-Royce was in town to talk up the second highest sales in its 113-year history and to show off one of the models that got the world's super rich all a quiver.
Are these TVs?
Yeah, these are picnic tables, but below are TV sets here.
It was the new Rolls-Royce Dawn model and the ability to customise your own luxury car, the so-called Black Badge, that drove record sales across every region bar the Middle East. Over 4,000 were sold in 2016. Not bad for a car with a starting price of £250,000.
I would say it's a remarkable achievement, plus 6% compared to the previous year, particularly in the light of many headwinds.
Those headwinds, of course, included Brexit, and they were braced for a slowdown post-June's referendum last year. But it didn't materialise. So how does he feel now?
I mean, for us, it's still lots of uncertainties in the market, and that is not really good for business. We know that. And for that reason, we are highly interested that we are getting certainty here. That's number one. Number two is, of course, that knowing that 90% of my cars I'm building in Goodwood, West Sussex, are exported, I'm highly interested that we don't see any trade barriers on an international level and that my sales internationally are not hampered by additional tariffs, additional taxes whatsoever.
He says he's hopeful the British government won't let that happen, but he's not ruling out a direct appeal to the Prime Minister herself if there isn't movement in the right direction.
You're the boss of Rolls-Royce. Can't you just pick up the phone and say, I need to talk to you about this?
I would not outrule this idea, let's say it like that, but time will show.
You're entitled to.
Yeah, time will show what we will do.
But even yesterday we heard the Prime Minister repeat that mantra that we can't have the bits of the EU that we choose, that really indicating again this sense of a hard Brexit and that control of borders immigration-wise is the most important thing. Inevitably then we will leave the single market.
Yeah, for me it is, and not only for me but for many people, it's very hard to judge really, I must say, currently, because nobody knows exactly what the outcome is. That is that kind of uncertainty I mentioned in the beginning, where I'm quite interested to get more clarity on what really happens and what doesn't happen. As long as we don't have clarity, for us it is business as normal.
But he is clear on one thing. The direction of travel under the new president-elect in the United States could spell trouble.
In general, protectionism worries me because I'm a fan and friend of global trade. And I think protectionism is not good. It's not good for industries, it's not good for economics, and it's not good for countries. And I think the free flow of goods worldwide was a substantial part for the prosperity we see in many, many countries currently worldwide.
To a degree, Rolls-Royce isn't like any other British manufacturer. Its customers are the super rich who want to own one of these cars regardless, and they can afford to. But outside in the real world, with the economic headwinds such as they are, even Rolls-Royce isn't immune. If Brexit negotiations go the wrong way and Britain ends up exiting the single market altogether,
then the outlook for this luxury car and its super rich clientele may look very different indeed.
At least 20 people have frozen to death as extraordinarily cold weather grips much of Europe. 10 died over the weekend in Poland, where temperatures plunged as low as minus 30 degrees Celsius. The bodies of 3 people were found in Bulgaria, and aid agencies have warned that refugees and the homeless across the continent are at risk of hypothermia.
To the United States now, where Donald Trump has got himself embroiled in another Twitter storm, this time with a Hollywood superstar. Receiving a Lifetime Achievement Award at last night's Golden Globes in Beverly Hills, Meryl Streep criticized the president-elect for mocking a disabled reporter. This morning, President-elect Trump took to Twitter to denounce Ms. Streep as one of the most overrated actresses in Hollywood. Our Washington correspondent Kylie Morris reports.
It was
was perhaps all singing, all dancing Golden Globes would take this golden opportunity to throw some shade at the Golden One himself. The president-elect has mocked Hollywood elites for being out-of-touch liberal lovies. Last night, the liberal lovies pulled a few moves of their own. There were light jabs.
This is the Golden Globes, one of the few places left where America still honors the popular vote. But
barbed asides.
That I'll be able to say I won this at the last ever Golden Globes. I don't mean to be gloomy, it's just that it has the words Hollywood, foreign and press in the title. I just don't know what.
But it was acting's First Lady Meryl Streep collecting a Lifetime Achievement Award who delivered the final scene. She began by defending Hollywood's diversity.
So Hollywood is crawling with outsiders and foreigners. And if we kick them all out, you'll have nothing to watch but football and mixed martial arts, which are not the arts.
She reflected upon Donald Trump's caricature of a disabled reporter, which he denies was intended to mock.
See this guy, I don't know what I said, I don't remember.
There was one performance this year that stunned me. It sank its hooks in my heart. Disrespect invites disrespect. Violence incites violence. When the powerful use their position to bully others, we all lose.
Hollywood sat silently, soaking up Streep's rebuke. A seething president-elect responded by tweet, calling Streep a Hillary flunky and one of the most overrated actresses in Hollywood. His people reiterated that Trump never meant to mock anyone with disabilities, urging observers to peer into his heart rather than listening to what he says.
You can't give him the benefit of the doubt on this, and he's telling you what was in his heart. You always want to go by what's come out of his mouth rather than look at what's in his heart.
Amidst all this showbiz handbagging, you might have missed a cameo performance by the British Foreign Secretary, who snuck into New York last night for an audience at Trump Tower. In fact, this video tidbit is the only evidence he was there at all. You might recognise the hair. More on who he met with in a moment, but there was no turn for the cameras alongside the president-elect. Today, that honour went to the head of Chinese e-commerce giant Alibaba.
We had a great meeting and a great entrepreneur, one of the best in the world, and he loves this country and he loves China.
Afterwards, the Alibaba boss talked of a plan for 1 million jobs in the US. And the bosses of luxury brand Louis Vuitton?
Jobs. A lot of jobs.
It's far from Hollywood, but Donald Trump knows his audience, and there's one script he's sticking to, the promise to bring jobs back to America.
And Kylie, chilly weather there in Washington for Boris on the Hill. How's he got on?
That's right. Boris is heading to the Hill this afternoon. Well, we don't know about the Hill meetings as yet. They're just beginning, actually. We know that he's going to meet with Newt Gingrich, as well as Paul Ryan, among others. But he has, as we mentioned, held that meeting last night at Trump Tower. We now know that that was with the chief strategist, Steve Bannon, as well as the son-in-law and soon-to-be senior advisor in the White House, Jared Kushner. Now, we've heard from the Foreign Office that it was a very warm meeting, apparently. It lasted around 90 minutes, and there were discussions of the full spectrum of foreign policy issues, although there is also acknowledgement that there are some areas of difference. Now, look, certainly the British government would like to believe that Britain is at the kind of front of this mysterious queue whereby there will be deals done by Donald Trump as soon as he enters the White House. But alongside that, there are real geopolitical differences on, for example, the Iran deal, on climate change. So there is certainly a lot of work to be done.
Well, unsurprisingly, the aforementioned Jared Kushner, the son-in-law of President-to-be Trump, has got a job. What is it?
Yes, senior advisor. It's kind of a formalisation, I think, John, of what we saw on the campaign trail, indeed. Jared Kushner was always there, kind of at the right hand of Trump. He's very well trusted. He's well liked by other members of the campaign team and indeed the White House team. Of course, he's married to Ivanka, Donald Trump's daughter, but he also himself comes from a background of real estate, of business in Manhattan. There is a real issue with this, of course. You might imagine that the son-in-law of the president would potentially be caught by anti-nepotism laws that exist in the US. However, it seems there will be some wriggle room potentially about whether or not the White House is an agency. No doubt we will see a lot of legal argument about that. There are also conflicts of interest potentially. Remember, he's a businessman, so he has international contacts, he has international contracts. They will have to be negotiated. But unlike his father, he's already said that he is committed to complying with federal ethics laws.
Kylie Morris on Capitol Hill.
Now, the three-month battle to recapture the city of Mosul, the last major stronghold of Islamic State militants in Iraq, is gathering pace. Iraqi security forces have reached one point along the banks of the River Tigris, which runs through the centre of the city. Mosul fell to IS in the summer of 2014 when the extremists swept across much of northern and western Iraq. Our Foreign Affairs correspondent Jonathan Rugman reports.
It is a battle fought street by street and sometimes house by house. But these Iraqi forces have now reached the River Tigris, running through the centre of Mosul. It's a symbolic milestone, though coalition airstrikes on the far side have made this bridge impossible to cross.
Thank God. Progress has been very good and there is not much left before we fully control the left bank.
This offensive began in October and it resumed last month after a lull due to bad weather and stiff resistance from so-called Islamic State. These Iraqi troops are being advised by American and other coalition forces who say coordination was at first almost non-existent but has now improved. Almost 40 IS militants were reported killed overnight, though they are still using civilians as human shields. These people were rescued. Others have been killed in the crossfire, their plight hampering the government's advance.
2 of the suicide bombers entered our house last night. We couldn't leave. Without the security forces, we wouldn't be here now. We thought we would.
This suicide belt was defused after the bomber was shot before he could blow himself up. American officials reckon the battle for Mosul could last another 2 to 4 months, though nobody knows when IS will run out of bombers or men prepared to fight. Civilians only dare flee to safety when their neighbourhoods are liberated, because they know IS snipers are hiding among them. They're escaping from homes with no water or electricity and precious little food or heating oil.
The mortars fell on our homes today, so we decided to leave. We've been trapped in our homes for 10 days. We could not leave. We could not even step outdoors.
These are residents from the east of the city. IS still controls the entire west, and because the Tigris bridges have been blown up, escaping from there may prove harder. Up to 1 million Iraqis are still trapped behind IS lines, this family thanking the soldiers for arriving at last. Between a quarter and a third of Iraq's second city has now been recaptured. But with so many unexploded bombs and mines, nobody can say when it will be safe to go back.
Jonathan Rugman reporting now. An inquest here has heard how a 25-year-old man electrocuted himself in his prison cell. The authorities at Chelmsford Prison had reduced constant supervision to half-hour observations before Dean Saunders was found dead on his cell floor. Our senior Home Affairs correspondent Simon Israel has this report.
Dean Saunders was a devoted father, a typical loving son, no history of mental illness, never a day in prison. But in Christmas 2015, that world collapsed. Paranoia set in. Thoughts became a volatile mixture of fear and self-harm. Then, within a fortnight, he was found dead, electrocuted, on a prison cell floor. His parents arrived at the opening of the inquest today, seeking answers to why promises weren't kept and why so little was seemingly done to safeguard his son from himself. Dean's parents and partner all gave evidence about their shock at his sudden decline into mental illness and about their expectation that he'd be in safe hands in prison. But each ended their testimony with the same thought: how he'd been let down, how he became just a number, how, in the words of one of them, he'd been treated no better than an animal. Dean ended up in Chelmsford Prison after being remanded on charges of attempted murder. The jury heard how he had attacked his brother with a knife, then stabbed his father as he struggled to stop his son stabbing himself. There were no spare local beds in mental health units, so the family were advised the best place would be the local prison hospital. The family said they were told Dean had been placed in a safe cell under constant supervision, but were to learn later that that had been reduced to 30 minutes observations. On the morning of the 4th of January last year, he was found lying on the floor, electrocuted. There were 3 uneaten meals in the cell. The cell camera was switched off, as it was prison policy, the inquest was told. Mark and Donna Saunders departed knowing they faced a long week in trying to find out why neither the mental health nor the criminal justice systems could protect their son. Dean Saunders became only the 3rd person in prison records to have died by electrocution.
Simon Israel reporting.
After the break, so just what is a shared society and what can it do to help those with mental health problems? We'll be debating the meaning of Theresa May's big idea and how it might differ from David Cameron's big society. Welcome back. So the Prime Minister has kicked off the new year with a new slogan, the Shared Society, designed to create fairer opportunity and tackle long-standing injustices. She identifies mental health care as one of these, saying that mental health has been dangerously disregarded as secondary to physical health. Theresa May wants to transform attitudes, focusing on mental care for children and young people and giving extra training to teachers.
The heart of the plan is a commitment to building a fairer society and tackling the burning injustices that have been allowed to stand for too long. And I want to turn to one of those burning injustices in particular. The burning injustice of mental health and inadequate treatment that demands a new approach from government and society as a whole. Let me be clear. Mental health problems affect people of all ages and all backgrounds. An estimated 1 in 4 of us has a common mental disorder at any one time.
Well, I'm joined now by 2 people who've both written about their own mental health issues, as well as Prime Minister's big ideas. Alistair Campbell was Tony Blair's press secretary and communications director. He's suffered from depression, is now a leading proponent of the mental health anti-stigma campaign, Time to Change. And Isabel Hardman has recently returned to her role as assistant editor of The Spectator after being treated for anxiety and depression. Alistair Campbell, do you see what this shared society adds up to and how it can help mental health?
Well, I would if there was a real commitment to it and to the policies that ought to flow from it. But it's the same as with David Cameron's big society. These were both, it seems to me, speeches where they felt they had to have a top line. But then when you, and I welcome the fact that she is talking about mental health, just as I welcomed a year ago when David Cameron made a very, very similar speech. But the reality is that you can talk all you want about a shared society, but in the last 5 years, funding for mental health services has been cut by 8%. We have 6,000 fewer mental health nurses. We have fewer beds per head of population than all the other major European countries. And my big worry about the speech that she made today is that she and other politicians are hoping that the anti-stigma campaign, which can lead to an improvement in attitudes, is not to accompany the services that we need to go alongside that, but actually is a substitute for that. And I really genuinely worry that the thing I really didn't like in her speech, where she talked about it, yes, it's not just about money. I agree it's not just about money, but the piece she wrote in the Sunday Telegraph yesterday, the sense I got was they're basically saying the stigma is more important than the services. Yeah. Now, the stigma is important, and we have to work at breaking that down. But the services are fundamental, and at the moment, they're not there.
Isabel Hardman, I mean, do you think she sort of crowbarred the mental health issue into what was supposed to be a big idea?
No, I think mental health has been an interest of Theresa May's for a long time. And like Alistair, I'm quite unimpressed with the sort of ambition that was set out in her speech, which was largely encouraging employers and schools to do more on mental health and then allocating a tiny pot of money from the government to improve support. But in the Home Office, she did actually improve the treatment of mentally ill people who end up in police cells, which was something that she saw as a massive injustice.
So did everyone else, to be fair. I mean, the police refused to do it, really, didn't
Well,
they?
she was the one who banned it, though, to be fair, and that's something that her allies always cite as a sign that she's serious about getting things done. But we need to see so much more than what we heard today before mental health is anywhere near equal in terms of its treatment to physical health.
I mean, if you look at the shared society as a big idea, do you understand what it is? I mean, isn't it just, let's make everything better? Or...
Yeah, I think it's a almost sort of Gordon Brown-esque rebranding exercise saying, I'm not like my predecessor. So David Cameron had the big society, and that was a rebranding from Margaret Thatcher talking about no such thing as society. She's saying, I've got the shared society, which is just so much different. But actually, in her Sunday Telegraph article and in her speech today, she talked about a commitment to fairness and respect for institutions. I mean, even Jeremy Corbyn agrees with those things. I don't really see what the great difference is in her vision.
Alistair Campbell, is there anything to disagree with about the shared society?
No, because in the end, it's all about the policies that flow from that. If you know, I've watched the whole of your programme tonight. If you want a shared society, then you have to address the problems of inequality that you see, where some people are sort of, shelling out £250,000 for a new car and driving past hundreds of people who are living on the streets. And I just thought, Isabel said there that there was a lack of ambition in that speech today. There's one bit in the speech that really jumped out at me. She said by 2021, no child will be sent away from their home area for mental health treatment. 2021. You had an interview earlier with a mother who is having to cope with long trips to see her daughter being treated for a mental health problem, and she's saying that it's going to take 4 years before we stop that. And I think the other thing that's at play here is that Theresa May, no fault of hers in the circumstances that she became Prime Minister, she's become the Prime Minister at the time of Brexit. And I think Brexit actually is consuming her, is consuming the government, and they don't have the time and the commitment to focus on these issues. And all I'm saying is that David Cameron made this speech a year ago. She mentioned mental health on the steps of Downing Street 6 months ago. Yes, she's made a speech, but a speech is not good enough unless it's backed up by the action that flows from that. Yeah. And it's not going to be met by giving £10 million to think ahead to train a few social workers.
Hardman,
great though that is.
If Brexit, has framed this, doesn't it also box her in that it really limits her ability to extend the state?
Well, and it's also a convenient excuse, isn't it? So David Cameron didn't really get underway with his big society project because of the coalition and the economic crisis. But actually, if you look at a useful model for Theresa May, could be Clement Attlee, who had plenty of excuses not to do anything leading a post-war government, but managed to set up the NHS and the welfare state. So politicians always have excuses not to do big radical things. But actually, if a Prime Minister who was leading an effectively bankrupt country was able to do what he did after the Second World War, surely Theresa May doesn't need to come up with excuses to do a few big things on mental health.
So she could, is what you're saying?
Well, she could if she wants to.
The question is, do you believe it's really a big idea? Or is this just a grope?
I think she's trying to set out what we didn't have in the Tory leadership contest. And I do think she believes that there is an injustice in the treatment of mental health. But she, as we've said, she needs to be much more ambitious and actually put money there, because this is one area that really needs money.
Just briefly, Alistair Campbell, we've got 30 seconds. Does it sound like a big idea to you?
No, it doesn't. It sounds like the top line for a speech and a few issues that she's throwing together. I completely agree with Isabel. Clement Attlee is a great example of somebody who Prime Ministers can and should do big things. This was not an ambitious speech.
Alistair Campbell, Isabel Hardman, thank you both very much indeed. John.
Well, now, at tonight's main news, the Health Secretary has said that up to 1 in 3 patients in accident and emergency may no longer have to be seen within 4 hours. Jeremy Hunt told MPs that around 3 in 10 of those who arrived at A&E were non-urgent cases who could be given other treatment, but he insisted that the 4-hour target remained in place. As to young mentally ill patients, they would get full facilities in 2021 and no longer have to travel long distances. That's all we have time for. That's Channel 4 News. Good evening.